Eleanor Whitmore did not cry the morning her husband came home. She had already done her crying 7 months ago, alone in the East Wing, with nothing but a candle and a letter she was never meant to read. By the time Nathaniel Ashford rode up the front drive with Caroline Mercer at his side, Eleanor was seated at the parlor table, back straight, hands folded, one document resting in front of her. She had been waiting. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel. Follow every part until the very end and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 arrived early to Ashford Estate. The heat came in from the Blue Ridge before June even settled, pressing itself against the tall windows of the main house like something that refused to be kept outside. The roses along the front drive bloomed fast and dropped faster. The creek at the edge of the south field ran lower than Thomas Reed had seen it run in 15 years. And Eleanor Whitmore Ashford, wife of the wealthiest landowner in Culpeper County, Virginia, sat at the long parlor table and did not look up when the front doors opened. She had heard the horses 20 minutes before they arrived. She had sent the parlor maids away 10 minutes before that. She wanted no witnesses for what was about to happen, not out of shame, but out of precision. What Eleanor intended to do required silence. It required stillness. It required the particular kind of calm that a woman only learns after she has survived the thing she was most afraid of and realized the surviving did not kill her. Nathaniel Ashford's boot struck the marble floor of the entry hall. She knew that sound. 8 years of marriage had pressed it into her memory the way a seal presses into wax, permanent, exact. She heard him pause. She heard the second lighter step that followed his. She heard the rustle of a traveling skirt. She did not look up. Eleanor. His voice carried the particular lightness of a man who believed himself charming. Nathaniel had always believed himself charming. It was Eleanor had come to understand the most dangerous thing about him, not his pride, not his temper, but his absolute certainty that his smile could undo whatever his behavior had broken. She picked up her pen. "Nathaniel," she said, "close the door behind you." A pause. She heard him glance back at the woman, presumably. She heard something whispered. Then the door clicked shut. "I wasn't expecting you until supper," he said. "I know." She dipped the pen. "Sit down." "Eleanor, I'd like to introduce—" "Sit down." She said it the same way she said everything. Quietly, without elevation, the way her father had taught her to speak when she was 12 years old, and the blacksmith's apprentice had laughed at her for asking a legal question in her father's office. "Lower your voice when you want someone to listen," her father had said. "Shouting tells them they have power over you. Calm tells them you have power over yourself." She heard 2 chairs pull back. 2 people sitting. She finished her signature on the bottom of the document in front of her, set the pen down with a small deliberate click, and looked up for the first time. Nathaniel Ashford was objectively a handsome man. 41 years old, broad-shouldered with the particular ease of someone who had never once stood in a room and wondered whether he belonged there. He wore his traveling coat well. His dark hair was longer than when he'd left almost 8 months ago in November, on the excuse of business in Richmond that had stretched and never quite resolved itself. Beside him sat Caroline Mercer. Eleanor had known about Caroline for 4 of those 8 months. She had learned the name from a letter not addressed to her, not meant for her, but slipped into the wrong leather satchel by a distracted courier who had since been quietly reassigned to the Western property. Eleanor had read that letter twice, refolded it along its original creases, and placed it inside a locked box in her study. Then she had made a list. Caroline Mercer was 27. She was the daughter of a Richmond political family with significant debts and significant connections. She was pretty in the way that Richmond produced pretty women carefully, deliberately, with considerable effort. She wore green, which suited her. She was not, Eleanor assessed without cruelty, a bad person. She was a woman who had made choices without understanding all the available information. Eleanor understood that. She had done the same thing herself once. "Caroline Mercer," Eleanor said, "Senator Mercer's youngest daughter. You were presented at the governor's reception in the spring of 1814. You wear your hair differently now. It suits you better. Caroline blinked. I thank you, ma'am. Eleanor? Nathaniel began leaning forward with the particular expression of a man who intends to control a narrative. I understand this must be— There's a document on the table in front of you, Eleanor said. He looked down, then back up. What is this? An accounting. She folded her hands in her lap. Of the past 7 years of our household finances, I had Mr. Caldwell prepare it. He was thorough. She paused. He was, in fact, considerably more thorough than you anticipated, I believe. Something shifted in Nathaniel's face. It was small, almost imperceptible. The charm slipped just slightly like a portrait that isn't quite level on the wall. I don't see why we need to discuss household accounts. My father's inheritance. Eleanor said, transferred to the Ashford estate, upon our marriage, was $46,000. I was informed at the time of transfer that it would be held in the estate accounts and managed jointly. She watched his jaw tighten. Mr. Caldwell found $31,000 of it. We have been trying to locate the remaining $15,000 for the past 3 months. Would you like to tell me where it is, Nathaniel, or shall we wait for the county magistrate to ask you directly? The room was absolutely silent. Caroline Mercer made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a gasp. Eleanor glanced at her once without malice and then returned to Nathaniel. He had gone very still. The charm was gone now. In its place was something older, something harder and colder, the face of a man who is calculating. You've been speaking to Caldwell behind my back, he said. Mr. Caldwell is my father's man, Eleanor said. He has always been my father's man. You simply assumed, because I never corrected that assumption, that your marriage to me had transferred his loyalty. That money was used for the estate. Some of it was. $11,000 roughly over the years. Improvements to the south field, the new barn, the repairs after the flood of 1812. All documented, all accounted for. She tapped the papers with one finger. The remaining $4,000, however, appears to have been withdrawn in small increments over 18 months and transferred to an account I am unable to locate. Mr. Caldwell believes he knows which bank. She held Nathaniel's gaze. The Richmond National. His chair scraped back slightly. Just a fraction, just enough. Where did you— I have been alone in this house for 8 months, Eleanor said. I had time to read. She stood. This surprised him. She could see it. He had expected her to stay seated. Staying seated was what a woman did when she was uncertain, when she was pleading, when she was waiting to be explained at. Eleanor had been explained at for 8 years. She was finished with it. She walked to the writing desk against the far wall, opened the second drawer, and removed a box. Not large, about the size of a Bible, dark walnut with a small brass lock. She set it on the table between them. I also found this, she said. Nathaniel's eyes dropped to the box. And something happened to him then that Eleanor had never once seen in 8 years of marriage. He looked afraid. Where did you get that? He said. Not a question. Barely even words. The East Room, Eleanor said. The one that's been locked since before we married. I had Thomas open it in April. She clasped her hands in front of her. You should know Thomas didn't want to. It took me 3 weeks to convince him. He is a loyal man, Nathaniel, considerably more loyal than you deserve. She paused. It's interesting, don't you think, how the people with the least power in a household are so often the most honorable? Eleanor. His voice had dropped. The lightness was entirely gone now. Eleanor, that box is not yours to— I haven't opened it, she said. Silence. I haven't opened it, she repeated. Because I wanted you in this room when I did. I wanted you to see my face when I read whatever is inside. I wanted you to have no way afterward to tell a different version of this story. She looked at him steadily. Because you are very good at telling different versions of stories, Nathaniel. You have been telling different versions of our story for 8 years. You told me when we married that you chose me, that it was my character, my mind, my family's good name. But Mr. Caldwell found something else. She reached into her pocket and placed a single folded letter on the table beside the box. A letter From your father to mine. Dated 1808, 3 months before our engagement. Caroline Mercer was completely still. Nathaniel did not move. Your father's estate was in debt, Eleanor said. Not publicly, not in a way that could be seen from the outside, but privately significantly, the kind of debt that ends in auctions and notices posted on courthouse doors. My father had money. My father also had a daughter he wanted settled respectably. She kept her voice even. They made an arrangement. I was not consulted. Eleanor, I am not angry about the arrangement, she said, and she meant it. This was what 8 months of solitude and careful thinking had produced, not fury, but clarity. I am not angry that our families made a practical decision. I am not even angry that you chose not to tell me. What I have spent 3 weeks trying to find the right word for, is done. She picked up the document from the table, the one she had been signing when he walked in. This is a petition to the Culpeper County Court, she said. It requests a formal accounting of the Whitmore inheritance funds transferred to the Ashford estate in 1809. It requests access to all financial documents pertaining to the estate accounts for the years 1809 through present. And it designates Mr. Caldwell as my legal representative in any proceedings. She set it back down. I filed a copy this morning. You'll have received the notice within the week. Nathaniel stood. His chair scraped back hard. You filed this without your permission. She looked at him. Nathaniel, it is my money. You are my wife. I am your wife, she agreed. Which means, under the laws of this state, I have very few independent rights regarding property. I know that. Mr. Caldwell knows that, which is why we did not file this as a property petition. She tilted her head slightly. We filed it as a fraud inquiry. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Fraud. Nathaniel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, shock, then calculation, then something that looked almost like panic before it settled into the cold blankness of a man who has decided to fight. You don't know what you're doing, he said. I know exactly what I'm doing, Eleanor said. I have known for 4 months. I spent 4 months making sure I was doing it correctly. You will destroy this family. This family, Eleanor said quietly, was already broken. I was simply the last person in the house to be told. She turned to Caroline Mercer. The young woman had gone pale. Her hands were pressed flat against the table in front of her. Not defensively, Eleanor thought, but in the posture of someone who is trying to hold herself steady against an unexpected current. Miss Mercer, Eleanor said, I don't believe you knew the full truth of this situation. I don't say that to be kind. I say it because I think it's accurate, and I have made a policy of saying accurate things. She kept her voice gentle. But there are some things you should know. About the accounts. About certain conversations Nathaniel had with your father. About what was offered and what was promised. She paused. When you are ready to hear them, I will tell you. Not today. Today has been enough for all of us. Binet said. Caroline looked at her a long searching look, the kind that a woman gives another woman when she is trying to determine whether she is being patronized or genuinely offered something. Thank you, Caroline said finally. Her voice was very small. Eleanor nodded once. Then she looked at her husband. You may stay in the guest rooms on the north corridor, she said, or you may go to the Harding Inn in town. That is your choice, but you will not come to my rooms. You will not remove any documents from the study or the East Wing, and you will not speak to Thomas or any member of the household staff about this matter. She held his gaze. Those are my terms for the present. My attorney will have additional terms within the fortnight. Nathaniel stared at her. For a moment, just a moment, she saw something cross his face that wasn't anger. It was something older than anger. Something that might have been once a long time ago the face of the man she had believed she was marrying. Then it closed again. You have no idea, he said quietly, what is in that box. Eleanor looked at the walnut box sitting between them on the table. The brass lock. The dark grain of the wood. Whatever was inside it, whatever had lived inside it for more than 20 years, locked in a room no one was permitted to enter, it had been waiting. "No," she said. "I don't. Not yet." She picked up the box and walked toward the door. "But I will by evening." She opened the parlor door. She walked through it. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard the silence of a room in which two people had been left with nothing to say to each other and everything to reckon with. Outside in the hallway, Thomas Reed was waiting. He was 55 years old, gray at the temples, with hands that had worked this estate since he was a boy of 12. He looked at the box in Eleanor's hands and then looked at her face, and his expression did something complicated, something between relief and grief, the look of a man who has carried a thing so long that the setting down of it hurts. "You told him," Thomas said. "I told him some of it," Eleanor said. "The rest I will learn tonight." Thomas nodded. He didn't reach for the box. He just stood there in the hallway of the house he had served for over 4 decades, with his hands at his sides and his jaw set the way a man stands when he is prepared for something he has been dreading his whole life. "Miss Eleanor," he said, "whatever you find in there." She met his eyes. "Whatever you find in there," he said again and stopped, started over. "I want you to know that I am sorry, for what I knew and didn't say, for what I watched happen and didn't stop. There are things a man tells himself, reasons, justifications, loyalty to the house, protecting what he thinks needs protecting." He swallowed. "I was wrong, and I am sorry." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Thomas," she said, "when I open this box tonight, I will need someone I can trust to be with me." He straightened slightly. "Will you come?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I will." She held the box against her chest and walked toward the stairs. Behind her, the summer heat pressed against the windows of Ashford Estate, heavy and unmoving the way truth presses before it finally breaks. She had a box to open. She had a marriage to reckon with. And somewhere at the bottom of it all, she had a feeling, the particular feeling of a woman who has been quiet for so long that her silence has become something else entirely, that before this summer was over, every locked door in this house was going to be opened. Every one. The box sat on Eleanor's writing desk for 3 hours before she opened it. Not because she was afraid. She had moved past fear sometime around February, in the coldest part of winter, when she had sat alone in this same room with her husband's letter in her hands, and understood fully and without flinching that the life she believed she was living had never quite existed. Fear requires uncertainty. Eleanor no longer had uncertainty. What she had instead was the particular stillness of a woman who knows the ground beneath her feet has already shifted and is simply waiting to see how far. Thomas came at 7 o'clock as she'd asked. He knocked twice his knock, the one she'd known since she was a new bride in this house, tentative and respectful. The knock of a man who has never once assumed he was welcome anywhere without being invited. She told him to come in. He entered, removed his hat, and stood near the door with his hands clasped in front of him. "Sit down, Thomas," she said. "I'm fine standing, Miss Eleanor." "I know you are. Sit down anyway." He sat. She looked at the box. Then she looked at him. "Before I open this, I want to ask you something. And I want you to understand that whatever you tell me, I am not going to punish you for it. I am not going to dismiss you. I am not going to use it against you. And I am not going to ask you to say it to anyone else, unless you choose to." She waited. "Do you understand?" Thomas nodded slowly. "What is in this box?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the candle on the desk flickered once in a draft from under the door, and the shadow it threw across his face made him look older than she had ever seen him. "The truth about this family," he said finally. "Nathaniel's family. The Ashford family." He paused. "And mine." Eleanor did not move. She simply looked at him and waited the way her father had taught her to wait, without filling silence, without rushing it, without giving the other person any reason to stop. "My mother," Thomas said, "came to this estate in 1789. She was a free woman, a seamstress from Fredericksburg. She was hired by Edmund Ashford, Nathaniel's father, to work in the house. He stopped, started again. She was 22 years old. And Edmund Ashford, Eleanor said quietly, was 41 and married. Thomas's jaw tightened. I was born in the spring of 1790. My mother named me Thomas Reed after her own father. She never said who mine was. Not publicly, not ever. He looked at the box. But she wrote it down. Eleanor reached forward and opened the box. The brass lock had no key. It never had, she realized now, because it was not the kind of lock that needed one. It was decorative. A display of security, rather than security itself, which struck her in this moment as the most Ashford thing she had ever encountered. Inside the box were 4 items. A letter folded 3 times the paper, soft with age. A document longer several pages tied with a faded ribbon. A small silver ring engraved on the interior with initials she could not yet read in the candlelight. And a miniature portrait oval set in a simple gilt frame, a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes, painted with the careful precision of someone who wanted to be remembered accurately. Eleanor picked up the portrait first. "Your mother," she said. "Yes," Thomas said. The word cost him something. She set the portrait down carefully and lifted the letter. She unfolded it and read it in silence. It took her perhaps 2 minutes. When she finished, she set it flat on the desk and placed her hand over it, not concealing it, just steadying herself against what she had read. "This is Edmund Ashford's handwriting," she said. "Yes. He acknowledges you, by name. He states explicitly that you are his son." She looked up. "And he states that upon his death you were to receive 1/3 of the Ashford estate." Thomas said nothing. "Thomas." She kept her voice even by considerable effort. Did Nathaniel know about this letter? The silence that followed was its own answer. But Thomas gave her a spoken one anyway, because she deserved that. "He found it before I did," Thomas said. "His father died in the spring of 1811. Nathaniel was the one who went through Edmund's study. He came to me 3 days after the funeral." He paused. "He sat me down in this very room, this was his father's study then, and he told me that he had found certain documents, that they contained information that would be damaging to the family's reputation, that the wisest thing for everyone involved was to lock them away and never speak of them again." Thomas's hands tightened in his lap. "He told me that if I stayed on as estate manager and said nothing, he would see to it that I was well compensated, that I would have security, that my position here was guaranteed." "And you agreed," Eleanor said. "Not an accusation, a statement." "I was 51 years old," Thomas said. "I had worked this land my whole life. I had nowhere else." He looked at her directly. "That is not an excuse. That is what happened." Eleanor stood. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him for a moment, looking out at the dark of the summer night, the shapes of trees, the distant flicker of a lantern near the barn. The ordinary, persistent life of a working estate that had been built on a foundation nobody was supposed to examine. "The document," she said. "The long one." "Edmund's original will," Thomas said. "The real one, before Nathaniel had a new one drafted." She turned around. "The will that was filed with the county court," Thomas said. "After Edmund's death, the one that left everything to Nathaniel was prepared by a lawyer in Richmond, a man Nathaniel had known since university. That document," he nodded toward the desk, "was prepared 2 years earlier by a different lawyer in Fredericksburg, Edmund's own lawyer." A pause. "The Fredericksburg lawyer died in the winter of 1810, 4 months before Edmund himself." Eleanor walked back to the desk. She picked up the long document, untied the ribbon, and began to read. It took her considerably longer than the letter. When she finished, she set it down, sat back in her chair, and looked at the ceiling for a moment, just a moment, with the expression of a woman who has just had the final piece of a very large puzzle placed into her hands and is taking stock of the complete picture. "1/3 to you," she said. "1/3 to Nathaniel. And 1/3, she stopped. "1/3 to the child," Thomas said. She looked at him. Edmund had a third child, Thomas said quietly. A daughter, born to a woman in Richmond. Legitimate Edmund and his first wife before Nathaniel's mother. She died in childbirth. The daughter was placed with a family, a decent family Edmund believed. He lost track of her during the war years, but he named her in the will. Her name, Eleanor said. Thomas met her eyes. Margaret, he said. Margaret Ashford, known later perhaps by another name entirely. Eleanor felt something very quiet and very large move through her chest. Do you know where she is? She asked. I have a suspicion, Thomas said. Nothing more. A name I heard once years ago from a man who knew Edmund in his younger days. He looked down at his hands. But Miss Eleanor, there is one more thing. She waited. The boy? Thomas said. Samuel. Eleanor had not yet heard the name Samuel in this context. She had heard Thomas mention a boy in passing once in the spring, when she had asked why a child's toys had been found in the East Wing. He had deflected, and she had let it go, filing it away for later. Later had apparently arrived. Tell me about Samuel, she said. Thomas exhaled. It was the breath of a man releasing something he has held for a very long time. His mother is a woman named Iris, he said. She was employed here briefly in 1814, in the kitchens. She left in the autumn of that year. He kept his eyes on the floor. She left because she was with child, Nathaniel's child. Eleanor's hands folded on the desk did not move. She lives now in a cottage near Culpeper Town, Thomas said. She and the boy. He is 8 years old. He has Nathaniel's eyes and his grandfather Edmund's chin, and he does not know his father's name because his mother has protected him from it. A pause. She has been protecting him from a great many things. Does Nathaniel know about the boy? Thomas looked up. Yes. Does Nathaniel provide for them? The silence was its own answer again. This time Thomas did not fill it with words. Eleanor stood up again. She moved with the particular purposefulness of someone who has just finished the last chapter of a very long book and has decided with complete clarity what to do next. She picked up the original will, folded it carefully, and placed it back in the box. She placed the letter on top of it. Then the portrait of Thomas's mother. Then last the small silver ring, which she held for a moment, turning it in the light, reading the initials engraved inside. E.A. for Thomas, my son. She placed it gently in the box and closed the lid. Thomas, she said, I need you to listen to me carefully because I am going to say this only once, and I need you to understand all of it. He straightened in his chair. You are the legitimate heir to 1/3 of this estate, she said. That is not sentiment. That is law if we can establish the validity of this document. I intend to try. She held his gaze. I also intend to find Margaret Ashford if she is findable, and I intend to see that Samuel and his mother are provided for properly, permanently, not at Nathaniel's discretion. Thomas opened his mouth. I am not doing this for noble reasons, Eleanor said, cutting him off cleanly. I am doing this because it is correct, because Edmund Ashford wrote down what was correct, and his son chose to bury it, and someone has to be willing to dig. She picked up the box. And also because Nathaniel has been spending my father's money on things I did not authorize, and I am disinclined to be gracious about it. Thomas made a sound that was almost not quite, but almost a laugh. There is a lawyer, Eleanor said, in Richmond. His name is Arthur Pembroke. He is not my father's man. I do not want anyone connected to the old arrangement. He came recommended by the county judge's wife last autumn at a dinner I attended alone because my husband was not in the state. She moved toward the door. I have already written to him. He arrives Thursday. Thomas stood. Miss Eleanor. She paused. Why are you doing this? He said. For me. After everything I kept from you. She turned to look at him. Because you came tonight when I asked. Because you have been sorry for years and simply lacked someone to say it to, and because... She stopped. Chose the words with care. Because this house has had enough silence, Thomas. I am finished with silence. She left the room. In the hallway, she almost walked directly into Caroline Mercer. The younger woman was in her nightdress and a shawl, clearly having been unable to sleep, clearly having spent the better part of the evening in a state that Eleanor recognized the particular wide-eyed stillness of someone who has just realized that the story they believed they were living in is not the story that was actually being told. They looked at each other in the dim hallway for a moment. "I didn't mean to," Caroline began. "You weren't eavesdropping," Eleanor said. "The walls in this house are thin, and the floorboards in the east corridor announce everything. I have known that for 8 years." She paused. "How much did you hear?" Caroline swallowed. "Enough." Eleanor studied her. "Come to the parlor. There are things I told you I would say when you were ready. I think you may be ready sooner than either of us expected." The parlor was dark except for the fire, and Eleanor did not light any additional lamps. She sat in the chair nearest the hearth and gestured to the one across from it, and Caroline sat in it with both hands wrapped around each other in her lap, like a woman bracing against cold in a room that was not cold. "Ask me what you want to ask," Eleanor said. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did he know about the will about Thomas when he married you?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "He had found the box the previous year." "And he married you anyway?" "He married me because my father's money solved a problem," Eleanor said. "Whether he felt anything beyond that I genuinely don't know, and I have stopped caring to find out." She looked at the fire. "What about you? What did he tell you about his marriage, about why what did he say to bring you here?" Caroline's jaw tightened. Something moved across her face, not quite shame, but adjacent to it. "He told me that the marriage had been over for years in every way that mattered, he said you were cold, that you had no interest in—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. I don't think those things are true." "They're not entirely untrue," Eleanor said, and she almost smiled, small, brief, genuine. "I am somewhat cold. I have a difficult time with sentiment. My mother used to say I was born with a lawyer's heart, which was not intended as a compliment, but which I have always taken as one." She looked at Caroline directly. "But cold and indifferent are different things. I cared about this marriage. I worked at it. I simply stopped explaining myself to a man who had decided very early on who I was and had no interest in discovering whether he was correct." Caroline looked at her hands. "He told me my father had agreed to there were conversations he said between my father and himself about the future, business arrangements. He made it sound as though—" She stopped again. Her voice had gone slightly unsteady. "He made it sound like I was a choice." Eleanor recognized that sentence in her own body. She recognized it the way you recognize a road you once walked in the dark. "Your father's debts," Eleanor said gently. "Are they considerable?" Caroline looked up sharply. "Mr. Caldwell found correspondence," Eleanor said. "He was not looking for it. It turned up in the estate accounts because Nathaniel had made certain guarantees, on your father's behalf." She held the younger woman's gaze and did not look away from the flinch she saw there. "I don't say this to hurt you. I say it because you need to know exactly what you walked into. Not the version Nathaniel told you, and not a softened version I'm offering to spare your feelings. The actual truth." Silence. Then Caroline said very quietly, "I walked into the same room you did." "Yes," Eleanor said. 11 years later, through a different door. But yes." They sat with that for a moment. Two women in a dark parlor in the Virginia summer with a fire burning between them, connected by the particular invisible thread of having been treated as instruments rather than people by the same man. "What are you going to do?" Caroline asked. "I am going to establish the validity of Edmund Ashford's original will," Eleanor said. "I am going to ensure that Thomas Reed receives what he is owed. I am going to find, if I can, the woman named Margaret Ashford Edmund's daughter, Nathaniel's half-sister, because she has a legal claim to this estate that no one has ever told her about." She set the box on the small table beside her. "And I am going to make certain that a boy named Samuel, who is 8 years old and has done nothing wrong, does not spend his childhood paying for his father's choices." Caroline stared at her. And Nathaniel. Nathaniel will answer to the county court for the missing funds from my father's estate. Beyond that? Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I am not interested in destroying him. I am interested in what is correct. Those are sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. I intend to follow the correct path and see where it leads. He won't allow it, Caroline said. He will fight you. He will use every... I know, Eleanor said. I have been preparing for that for 4 months. She paused. Miss Mercer. Caroline. She waited until the younger woman looked at her. I want to ask you something, and I want you to take your time before you answer. Caroline nodded. When Nathaniel told you about me, when he described this marriage as finished, when he brought you here, did any part of you doubt him? A long silence. Yes, Caroline said finally. Yes, there were things he said that didn't quite... She stopped. But I wanted to believe him. I know, Eleanor said. I understand that precisely. She stood. Here is what I think for whatever my thinking is worth. I think you came here because you believed something was true. I think you are finding out that it was not. I think what you do next is entirely your own choice. I am not asking anything of you. I am not expecting anything of you, and I will not hold against you anything that happened before you walked into this house today and began to learn the truth. She looked at her directly. But if you want to know more about your father's dealings with Nathaniel, about what was promised and what was paid, I will show you the documents. Caroline was quiet. You said Nathaniel wouldn't let you do this, Caroline said finally. That he would fight. Yes. And yet you seem, she searched for the word, unfrightened. Eleanor considered this. A man can only threaten you with the things you are afraid of losing, she said. I spent 8 months deciding what I am afraid of losing. It turned out to be a much shorter list than I expected. She picked up her candle. Get some rest, Caroline. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. She left the parlor. The house was quiet around her as she climbed the stairs, the ordinary night sounds of a large house wood settling against the heat, the distant call of something in the tree line, the soft breath of a summer that had no idea what it was in the middle of. She did not go directly to her room. She went first to the east wing. The room Thomas had opened for her in April, the room that had been locked for more than 20 years, stood with its door slightly ajar. Now the way she had left it that first morning, after she had gone through it piece by piece, cataloging everything, leaving nothing in its original position because she had wanted it all seen, all examined, all brought into the light. She pushed the door open and stood in the doorway. The room had once been a child's room. She had worked that out gradually over the course of several visits. The furniture was too large to have been original. It had been brought in later, she thought, when someone wanted to make the room look like a storage room and not a nursery. But there were marks on the doorframe, small marks penciled in the way parents measure a child's height. The lowest mark was barely 2 feet off the ground. The highest was not much more than 4. The child had not grown up in this room. She now knew why. She closed the door quietly and walked to her room at the end of the corridor. She set the box on her nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, not bothering with a candle, because she did not need to see anything else tonight. She had seen enough. She had read enough. She knew enough. Nathaniel was in the north wing. She could not hear him. She did not want to. She thought about Thomas, who had carried half his life in a box in a locked room and called it loyalty. She thought about Caroline, who had walked into this house believing one story and was already beginning to understand it was another. She thought about Iris in a cottage near Culpeper Town, raising a boy alone with his father's eyes and no knowledge of what he was owed. She thought about a girl named Margaret somewhere in this state or the next who did not know her own last name was Ashford. She thought about her father's $46,000 and what had been done with it and what it would take to recover what was recoverable. She thought about Arthur Pembroke arriving Thursday from Richmond and what she was going to put in front of him and what she was going to ask him to do. Then she stopped thinking about all of it deliberately, with the same precision she applied to everything, and lay down on top of the coverlet and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, Nathaniel would make his first move. She did not know yet what it would be. She knew only that it was coming because men like Nathaniel did not receive petitions from county courts and revelations from locked boxes and spend the night doing nothing. They regrouped. They calculated. They found the angle they believed was available to them. Whatever angle he found, she intended to be standing at it when he arrived. She was still awake when the hall clock struck midnight. She was awake when it struck 1. She was almost asleep when she heard very quietly the sound of boots in the corridor outside her door, unhurried, deliberate, the step of someone who had been drinking just enough to feel confident and not enough to lose precision. They stopped outside her door. She did not move. She lay still in the dark and listened. The doorknob turned. She had locked it 3 months ago and had not once unlocked it since. A pause. The knob turned again, harder this time. Then a long silence. Then Nathaniel's voice, low and even, just outside the door. "Eleanor, we need to speak." She said nothing. "I know you're awake," he said. She stared at the ceiling in the dark. "There are things you don't understand yet," he said. "About that box, about Thomas, about what my father was and what he did and why I made the choices I made. You think you know the whole story, but you are missing Eleanor. Would you please open this door?" She sat up. She swung her legs over the side of the bed. She walked barefoot and unhurried to the door, and she stood on her side of it and said no. A beat. "I beg your pardon." "No," she said again. "I will not open the door. We will speak when Mr. Pembroke arrives on Thursday, and we will speak in his presence, and anything you wish to say to me about that box, and your father, and the choices you made will be said then, where it can be heard and recorded properly." A pause. "Go to bed, Nathaniel." "Eleanor, I found the will," she said. "I found Thomas's mother's letter. I found Edmund's acknowledgement." Her voice was very steady. "I also found the mark in the east room doorframe where someone measured a child who never grew up in that house. I don't know that child's story yet, but I will." She put her hand flat against the door. "Good night." Footsteps, retreating. Slow, deliberate, the walk of a man who is already thinking about his next move. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she walked back to the bed, sat down, and reached for the box on the nightstand. She opened it. In the dark, by memory, she found the small silver ring and held it in her palm. E.A. for Thomas. My son. Edmund Ashford had written it down. He had made a ring. He had prepared a will. He had tried in the limited ways available to him to do something correct, and then he had died before it could take hold, and his son had buried it. But he had written it down, and Eleanor had learned from her father, from 8 years of this marriage, from 4 months of solitude and paper and ink, written things endure. Spoken words can be denied, reframed, forgotten, or lied about. Written things sit in boxes and wait. They had been waiting 20 years. They would not have to wait much longer. She closed her hand around the ring, and finally, at last, slept. Arthur Pembroke arrived on Thursday morning 40 minutes early, which Eleanor took as a good sign. He was not what she had expected. She had expected someone older, her father's generation, the kind of lawyer who wore his authority in the cut of his coat and the careful way he chose his words. Pembroke was perhaps 38, lean and precise, with ink-stained fingers, and the eyes of a man who read documents the way other men read faces. He came alone, no clerk, no assistant, which she also took as a good sign. Men who brought an audience to preliminary meetings were men who needed witnesses to their own importance. Pembroke had brought a leather satchel and a list of questions. He sat across from her at the parlor table and did not make small talk. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "you wrote that you had documents pertaining to the original disposition of the Ashford estate. I'd like to see them before we discuss anything else, if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," Eleanor said, and placed the box on the table between them. He went through everything methodically. The will first, all 7 pages, reading each one with the stillness of someone who does not react until he has the complete picture. Then the letter of acknowledgement. Then the financial documents Mr. Caldwell had prepared regarding her father's inheritance. He read without expression, which Eleanor respected. Lawyers who reacted to documents while reading them were lawyers who were still learning what they were looking at. When he finished, he closed the last page, folded his hands on top of the stack, and looked at her. "How long have you had these?" he asked. "The financial documents 4 months. The contents of the box 6 days. And your husband is currently in residence?" "In the North Wing. He has made no move to leave and no formal response to the county petition." She paused. "He knocked on my door on Tuesday night and asked to speak with me. I declined." Pembroke looked at her steadily. "He's going to challenge the will's validity." "I know. The Fredericksburg lawyer who prepared it is dead. The witnesses listed at the bottom. I have already sent Thomas to Fredericksburg to inquire after them," Eleanor said. "2 are dead. One, a woman named Helen Pruitt, who was Edmund Ashford's housekeeper in his earlier years, is alive. She is 71 years old and living with her daughter outside of town." Eleanor met his eyes. "Thomas left yesterday morning." Pembroke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've been doing my job for 4 months. "I've been doing what needed doing," Eleanor said. "I didn't know yet what your job was." He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but it came close. "Tell me about Thomas Reed." She told him everything. She told him about the East Room, about Edmund Ashford's relationship with Thomas's mother, about the ring with its engraved inscription, about Nathaniel's conversation with Thomas after Edmund's death, the conversation in which Nathaniel had offered security in exchange for silence. She told it without editorial, without anger in her voice, the way her father had taught her to give testimony, facts, sequence evidence. Pembroke listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up the letter of acknowledgement again and read one section a second time. Then he set it down and said, "The boy, the one you mentioned, Samuel." "Nathaniel's son," Eleanor said. "By a woman named Iris, who was employed here in 1814. She lives near Culpeper Town. I have not yet contacted her directly." "Don't," Pembroke said. "Not yet. Let me make that approach. If this goes to a formal proceeding, her testimony may be relevant, and I don't want it complicated by a prior conversation that Nathaniel's lawyer could characterize as coordination." He paused. "Nathaniel does have a lawyer, I assume." "He sent a letter to Richmond yesterday morning," Eleanor said. "The courier left before 7. I don't know who he's written to, but I would expect a response within the week." Pembroke studied her. "You watch your household carefully." "I watch everything carefully," Eleanor said. "I always have. My husband simply assumed that a woman who watches quietly is a woman who sees nothing." Pembroke picked up his pen and began to write. They worked for 3 hours. By the time he stood to leave, Eleanor had given him copies of every document, had provided a written account of the conversation between Nathaniel and Thomas. In 1811, had listed every financial irregularity Mr. Caldwell had identified and had answered 47 questions, with the specificity of someone who had been rehearsing for this meeting for months, because she had been. At the door, Pembroke paused. "Mrs. Ashford, one thing I must ask directly because I need to know where we stand." "Ask." "What is your objective? Not the legal objective, the personal one. What do you want out of this?" Eleanor considered. It was not a simple question, and she had learned to distrust simple answers to complicated questions. "I want what is correct," she said. "Thomas Reed should receive what his father intended him to receive. The woman named Margaret Ashford should know her own name and her own claim. Iris and her son should be provided for permanently, not at Nathaniel's discretion. My father's money should be accounted for." She paused. "And I want not revenge, not his ruin. I want the truth on record. In a document, in a court. Somewhere that cannot be locked in a box and buried." Pembroke nodded. He picked up his satchel. "I'll be in touch by Monday." He left. Eleanor stood in the entry hall for a moment, after the door closed, in the particular silence that follows the departure of someone who has just become an important variable in your life. Then she heard it. A door. Not the front. The side entrance near the kitchen corridor. Then a child's voice, high and carrying, "I told you I seen it from outside. The big window. The one with the green curtain." Then a woman's voice, lower strained, "Samuel, hush." Eleanor walked toward the sound. She came around the corner into the back hallway and stopped. Standing near the kitchen door were two people she had never seen before. A woman, perhaps 30, with the particular worn quality of someone who has been managing difficulty alone for a long time. Her dress clean but carefully mended her posture straight in the way people hold themselves straight when they are uncertain of their welcome. And beside her, with his hand in hers, and his neck craned back to look at the ceiling of the hallway, as though it were the most interesting thing he had ever encountered, was a boy. He was small for 8, dark-haired, and when he turned his head and looked at Eleanor directly, she felt something hit her in the center of her chest, like a fist, because the shape of his face, the jaw, the brow was Nathaniel's face, unmistakably, without any possible doubt. The woman saw Eleanor's expression and pulled the boy slightly behind her. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I'm sorry we came to the kitchen door. I didn't mean to. I wasn't going to come to the main house. I know I shouldn't have, but Samuel, he—" She stopped, collected herself visibly. "My name is Iris Beckett. I believe you are Mrs. Ashford." "I am," Eleanor said. She kept her voice very calm. "How did you know to come today?" "I didn't," Iris said. "I came because there was a man here last week. Thomas. I know Thomas from before, from when I worked here. He came to my cottage 2 days ago, and he told me—" She glanced down at Samuel, then back up at Eleanor, with the particular look of a woman who is choosing her words around a child. "He told me some things had changed, that there might be someone it was safe to speak to. Thomas had gone to Fredericksburg. She had watched him leave herself. She turned the timeline over in her head, and then understood he had gone to Iris's cottage on his way out of Culpeper before he left for Fredericksburg. He had not mentioned it. She made a mental note to speak with him about managing information unilaterally, and then a second mental note to thank him before she did. "Come inside," Eleanor said. "Not the kitchen, the parlor." Iris hesitated. "Mrs. Ashford, I don't want to cause any trouble. I only wanted to—" "You're not causing trouble," Eleanor said. "You came because Thomas told you something had changed. He was right. Something has changed." She looked at the boy. "Hello, Samuel." He looked at her with the direct, unself-conscious assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise his curiosity. "Are you the lady of the house?" he asked. "I am." "Thomas said you were smart," he said. "He said you were the smartest person in the county, probably." "Thomas is generous," Eleanor said. "Come inside, both of you." She settled them in the parlor, Iris on the edge of the settee, holding her hands in her lap, with careful stillness, Samuel beside her for approximately 90 seconds, before the unfamiliar room defeated his ability to stay seated. And he began a quiet, methodical examination of everything within reach. Eleanor let him. She had learned from watching her father conduct interviews when she was young that children who are allowed to move talk more freely than children who are told to sit still. She looked at Iris. "Tell me what Thomas told you." "That there were documents," Iris said, "in a locked room, that they involved my son." She swallowed. "I've known for years that Samuel has a claim. I knew it when he was born. But I also knew that without someone willing to stand behind that claim—" She stopped. "I have no money for lawyers. I have no family here. My parents are in Maryland. I had no one who could—" "I know," Eleanor said. "I understand exactly the position you were in." Iris looked at her carefully as though trying to determine whether that was true, or whether it was the polite approximation of understanding that wealthy women sometimes offered to women who were not wealthy. Eleanor let her look. She was used to being assessed and was not troubled by it. "He knows about Samuel," Iris said. "Nathaniel. He has known since Samuel was 4 months old. I wrote to him. I did not ask for much. I asked for enough to keep Samuel fed and housed and educated." Her voice went flat in the particular way that voices go flat when they are keeping emotion out of range. "He sent a man to my cottage. Not Nathaniel himself, a man, who offered me money to sign a document saying Samuel was the son of another man, a man I had never met, and to take the money and leave Virginia entirely. Eleanor felt the anger move through her clean and cold. "And you refused?" "I refused," Iris said. "I sent the man away. 2 weeks later, someone broke the lock on my cottage door and went through everything inside." She met Eleanor's eyes. "They didn't find anything worth taking. I had nothing worth taking. But I understood the message. Mama." Samuel had stopped his circuit of the room. He was standing beside the writing desk, pointing at something on the wall above it. "That picture. That's the same as the one in the old man's cottage." Eleanor turned. He was pointing at a small oval portrait, one of several, hanging on the parlor wall, a collection of Ashford family likenesses that she had always found slightly oppressive in their combined gaze. She crossed to him and looked at the one he was indicating. It was a portrait of Edmund Ashford. Painted around 1800, she estimated when he would have been in his 50s. She had looked at it 100 times without particular interest. "What old man's cottage?" she asked Samuel. "The one on Miller's Road," Samuel said, with the absolute confidence of a child reporting established fact. "The old man who gave me the penny last winter. He has the same picture but smaller." He tilted his head. "Except in his it says something on the back. He showed me once." Eleanor looked at Iris. Iris's brow had furrowed. "I don't know what cottage he means. Samuel sometimes wanders when I'm working." Eleanor crouched slightly so she was at the boy's level. "Samuel, the old man on Miller's Road. What is his name?" Samuel thought about this with the seriousness of a child who understands that names are important. "He didn't tell me his name," he said. "He said names get people into trouble. He said I should call him the man with the bees because he keeps bees." A pause. "He has a lot of bees." "How old is he?" "Old," Samuel said, with the confident imprecision of an 8-year-old. "Real old. Older than Thomas." Eleanor straightened. She looked at Iris. "Miller's Road runs north from Culpeper Town." "I know the road," Iris said. Her voice had changed slightly. "There's a property at the far end. It's been empty as long as I can remember, people say. But there's smoke from the chimney sometimes in winter." "A man with bees," Eleanor said slowly, "who has a miniature portrait of Edmund Ashford and knows that names get people into trouble." She looked at Samuel again. "And he gave you a penny." "Last February," Samuel confirmed, "when it was cold. He said I looked like I needed warming up, and he didn't have a fire to offer, but he had a penny, which was the next best thing." He considered. "I liked him." Eleanor stood and walked to the window. She stood there with her back to them for a moment, working through it, the timeline, the geography, the portrait, the knowledge of names being dangerous. Edmund Ashford had died in 1811. His will had named 3 heirs. She had 2 of them in this room. The third was a woman named Margaret, sent to a family Edmund had lost track of during the war years. But Edmund's will had been written in 1809, before he died, before he lost track of anyone. What if someone else had been keeping track? "Iris," she said without turning around. "When you lived here before you left, did Thomas ever mention anyone? A person outside the estate who had known Edmund Ashford in his earlier years? An old friend, a former associate, anyone Edmund had trusted privately separate from the household?" Iris thought. There was Thomas mentioned once very briefly, a man who had been Edmund's steward before Thomas. He left the estate when Nathaniel took over. Thomas said the man knew things that made him unwelcome. She paused. He said the man had gone north of town. That was all. Eleanor turned around. "I need to go to Miller's Road," she said. "Mrs. Ashford." "Not today," Eleanor said. "Not alone, and not without Thomas, who will be back from Fredericksburg by Sunday." She came back to the settee and sat down across from Iris with the expression of someone who has just reorganized a significant amount of information and arrived at the next necessary step. "Iris, I need to ask you something," and I want you to hear it clearly before you answer." Iris met her eyes. "Are you willing to speak to a lawyer?" "A man named Pembroke from Richmond. He's acting on my behalf, but Samuel's claim is part of what he's working on, and I want to do this correctly. Not a private arrangement, not a handshake, something recorded. Something that cannot be undone by the next person who holds power in this house." She paused. "If this works the way I believe it can work, Samuel will have a legal claim to a portion of this estate. Not dependent on Nathaniel's generosity. Not revocable, established in law." Iris was very still. "That is what you wanted when you refused to sign his document," Eleanor said. "That's why you stayed in Virginia. That's why you kept Samuel here instead of taking him to your family in Maryland." Iris's breath came out slowly, unevenly. "Yes," she said. "That's why." "Then work with Pembroke," Eleanor said. "And in the meantime, stay in Culpeper. Don't go far. And if any man comes to your cottage again with any kind of document and any kind of offer—" "I know," Iris said quietly. "I've had practice refusing." Eleanor nodded. She looked at Samuel, who had resumed his examination of the room and was now standing on his toes trying to see the top of the bookshelf. "He's bright," she said very quietly to Iris. "He's everything," Iris said just as quietly. Eleanor looked at her. Something passed between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the particular acknowledgement of two women who have been managing alone and have just unexpectedly found someone standing on the same ground. She walked them out through the kitchen door the way they'd come. She watched them cross the kitchen yard and turn toward the road, the boy still talking Iris, with her hand on his shoulder, the summer heat pressing down on both of them. She was still standing in the doorway when she heard Nathaniel's voice behind her. "Who was that?" She turned. He was standing in the kitchen corridor closer than she expected, with the particular stillness of a man who had been watching for longer than the question implied. "A woman from town," Eleanor said, "and her son." "What did she want?" "Conversation," Eleanor said. She stepped back inside and moved past him toward the hallway. "Nathaniel, I have a question for you." "Eleanor, Miller's Road," she said. "North End. Who lives there?" He said nothing. But his face did something. It was small, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional stillness, the particular expression of a man who has been asked a question he did not expect, and is taking a half-second too long to decide how to answer. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said. "A man with bees," Eleanor said. "Edmund's former steward, I believe, the one who left the estate when you took over. The one Thomas said knew things that made him unwelcome." She watched his face. "He has a miniature portrait of your father. He told a child that names get people into trouble." Nathaniel's jaw set. "Eleanor, there are things in motion that you don't fully understand, and if you continue down this path without—" "I sent Arthur Pembroke to Richmond this morning with copies of every document from the box," Eleanor said. "Originals are with Mr. Caldwell, who has already provided the county magistrate's office with a preliminary inventory." She held his gaze. "If something were to happen to me or to Thomas, or to the contents of this house, every piece of evidence I have found is already in 4 separate locations with 4 separate people who have been instructed to proceed regardless." She paused. "I mentioned that not as a threat, only as information." He stared at her. "I am not your enemy, Nathaniel," she said. "I am the person who found the box. That is all. What you choose to do with that fact is your decision." She walked toward the hallway. "I'll be in my study this afternoon. If you'd like to have an actual conversation, not through a closed door, not at midnight, but a real conversation, I am willing to do that." She left him standing in the kitchen corridor. She went directly to her study, sat at her desk, and wrote 4 letters in quick succession. One to Pembroke, describing Samuel's account of the man on Miller's Road, and requesting immediate inquiry into the identity of Edmund Ashford's former steward. One to Mr. Caldwell, asking him to check the county land records for any property on Miller's Road registered under any name connected to the Ashford estate. One to a woman she knew in Culpeper town, the judge's wife, Reliable and discreet, asking whether she had any knowledge of the property at the north end of Miller's Road and who had lived there. And the fourth letter she held for a moment before she wrote it because it required the most care. She addressed it to Thomas. She told him about Samuel's account of the old man. She told him about the miniature portrait. She told him about the phrase "names get people into trouble." She asked him when he was finished in Fredericksburg to go to Miller's Road before he came home. She asked him to find out who the man with the bees was. She sealed all 4 letters, addressed them, and called the youngest of the household staff, a girl of 16, who was reliable and fast, to take them into town immediately. Then she sat back in her chair. The room was quiet. Outside, the heat of the afternoon had settled into the particular thickness of a Virginia July, the kind that makes the air feel inhabited, weighted, present. She could hear from somewhere on the far side of the house the sound of Nathaniel moving his footsteps, measured and deliberate, the stride of a man who is thinking. She knew that stride. She had listened to it for 8 years. She thought about the miniature portrait in the box Thomas's mother painted with careful accuracy, a woman who had wanted to be remembered as she actually was. She thought about Edmund Ashford, who had prepared a will and a ring and a letter, and then died before any of it could hold. She thought about a steward who had left because he knew too much and had gone north on Miller's Road and kept bees and given pennies to a boy who looked like the family he used to serve. Witnesses, she thought, not just documents. Witnesses. This was the part Nathaniel had not accounted for. He had buried the documents, yes. He had managed the money, the lawyers, the official record. He had controlled the narrative inside the house and the story outside it. But he had not accounted for the people Thomas who had held his silence but never surrendered his conscience. Iris, who had refused to sign. An old steward on Miller's Road who had never quite gone away. And Eleanor herself, who had spent 8 months in a quiet house, reading everything she could find. She was still at her desk when the door to her study opened without a knock. She looked up. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. He looked different from this morning, not disheveled, that wasn't the word, but reduced somehow. The particular confident ease that he wore like a coat had thinned. What was underneath it was something she had not often seen from him: uncertainty. "I want to talk," he said. "Close the door," she said. "Sit down." He did both. He sat across from her at the desk, the same configuration as the morning he had arrived, but different in every way that mattered. Then she had held all the cards, and he had not known it. Now he knew it, and he was here because he had run his calculations and arrived at a conclusion she had expected him to arrive at eventually. "The man on Miller's Road," he said. "His name is Erasmus Cole. He was my father's steward for 22 years. He said it flatly, without preamble. He knows about the will. He was one of the witnesses who signed it. Eleanor kept her face still. "He also knows," Nathaniel said, "about Margaret." There it was. "Tell me," Eleanor said. Nathaniel looked at his hands. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be deciding how much to give her, doing the calculation, measuring out the minimum. Then he looked up, and she saw something she had almost never seen in 8 years of marriage. He looked tired. Not physically. Something deeper than that. "Margaret is in Philadelphia," he said. "She has been in Philadelphia for 11 years. She married a man named Foster, a merchant. Decent man, she has children now. She doesn't know." He stopped. "She has never known." "Erasmus Cole knows where she is," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "Erasmus Cole has been writing to her for years," Nathaniel said. "Not about the estate, not about the claim, just letters. As a man who knew her father, she thinks he's an old family acquaintance." He paused. "He has been waiting." "For what?" Nathaniel met her eyes. "For someone to open the box," he said. The room held that sentence for a moment. Eleanor reached for her pen. "You're going to write down Erasmus Cole's full address," she said, "and Margaret Foster's address in Philadelphia. And you are going to tell me exactly what you told Thomas in 1811, every word as precisely as you can recall it." She set a clean sheet of paper on the desk and pushed it toward him. Because Pembroke will have those addresses within the week regardless. The only question is whether you give them to me now, which suggests some measure of good faith, or whether he finds them himself, which suggests none. Nathaniel looked at the paper. He picked up the pen, and for the first time in 8 years, Eleanor watched her husband begin to tell the truth. It came out slowly at first, then faster, the way water comes through a crack in a dam, tentative, and then inevitable. He wrote the addresses. He wrote the conversation with Thomas. He wrote in his own hand the name of the Richmond lawyer who had prepared the false will, and the amount that lawyer had been paid, and the date it had been paid. Eleanor did not speak. She let him write. When he finished, he set the pen down and sat back and looked at her with the face of a man who has just put down a weight he didn't know was killing him. "Eleanor," he said, "I know there's nothing I can say that—" "Not today," she said quietly. She picked up the paper. "Today you've done something useful. That's enough for today." She folded the paper and placed it in the inside pocket of her writing case. Then she looked at him directly one last time before the day was over and whatever came next began. "Nathaniel," she said. "The boy. Samuel. He is your son." He said nothing. He gave a penny to a child he didn't know because the child looked like he needed warming up, Eleanor said. "He is 8 years old, and he has your face, and he does not know your name." She held his gaze without softness and without cruelty, just with the plain insistence of a fact that needed to exist in the air between them. "Whatever happens with the courts and the will and the accounts, you need to reckon with that separately, as a man, not as a defendant." He didn't answer. She did not ask him to. She stood, gathered her papers, walked to the door, and left him sitting alone in the study with the summer pressing in at the windows and the weight of 20 years of buried things finally irrevocably beginning to rise. Thomas came back from Fredericksburg on Sunday evening as Eleanor had expected. What she had not expected was that he would not come alone. She heard the horses in the drive just as the last light was going out of the sky, and she came to the front window and saw 2 figures dismounting Thomas, and beside him a woman she did not recognize. Not young, perhaps 65, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints had opinions about the summer heat. She wore a plain gray traveling dress and carried a small bag, and she stood in the drive and looked up at the front of Ashford Estate with an expression that Eleanor could not read from the window, but which made her set down her book immediately and go to the door. Thomas saw her on the steps and said simply, "She insisted on coming herself." The woman looked at Eleanor with sharp, pale eyes that had the quality of eyes that have spent a long time watching and recording. "You're the wife," she said. Not unkindly, directly. "I am," Eleanor said. "And you are Helen Pruitt." "Was," the woman said. "Helen Pruitt was who I was when I worked for Edmund Ashford. Been Helen Garner for 30 years now, but yes." She looked past Eleanor into the house. "I signed that will. My hand is on that paper. If someone needs me to say so in front of a judge, I'll say so." She paused. "I've been waiting for someone to ask for a long time." Eleanor stepped back from the door. "Come inside, Mrs. Garner, both of you." She put Helen Garner in the best guest room, not the north corridor where Nathaniel was, but the south wing as far from him as the house permitted. She sent word to the kitchen for supper to be brought up. Then she went back downstairs and found Thomas in the hallway waiting. "Miller's Road," she said. "I went," Thomas said, "before Fredericksburg and again on my way back." He paused. "Erasmus Cole is alive. He's 81 years old, and he's been keeping bees on that property since 1812. A breath. "He cried, Miss Eleanor, when I told him you had opened the box. He sat down in his chair, and he cried like I've never seen an old man cry." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He has letters," Thomas said. 20 years of letters he never sent because there was no one to send them to who could do anything with them. Letters about what he knew, what he witnessed, what Edmund told him privately in the last year of his life. He reached into his coat and removed a bundle, perhaps 30 letters tied with kitchen twine, the paper soft with handling. "He wants you to have them." She took the bundle. "And Margaret Foster," she said. In Philadelphia. Cole has written to her, Thomas said. Not about the claim, not yet. He wrote to tell her that things had changed, that there was someone in this house she ought to hear from. He met her eyes. She wrote back within the week. Cole received her letter 2 days ago. He gave it to me. He reached into his coat again. Eleanor took the letter. She did not open it immediately. She held it and looked at Thomas and said, "Is she willing?" "Read the letter," Thomas said. And for the first time in weeks, the shadow on his face lifted just slightly. "Read it, and then tell me what you think." She read it standing in the hallway because she could not make herself wait to find a chair. Margaret Foster, née Ashford. Though she had not known it until Erasmus Cole had begun carefully and over years to tell her what he knew, wrote in a clear, angular hand that moved across the page with the efficiency of a woman who had things to say and limited patience for preamble. She was 44 years old. She had 3 children, a husband who was aware of this correspondence, and a lawyer in Philadelphia she had already consulted. She had known for 6 years that she was Edmund Ashford's daughter. She had not known until Cole's most recent letter that there was a will. She had not known there was anyone in Virginia willing to act on it. The last paragraph was brief. Eleanor read it twice. "I have waited a long time to be told my own name. If Mrs. Ashford is willing to have me, I will come to Virginia. I can be there within a fortnight. I have things to say that I believe are better said in person in that house where they belong." Eleanor folded the letter. "Write to her tonight," she told Thomas. "Tell her to come." He nodded. He started for the hallway. Then he stopped. "Miss Eleanor, Nathaniel has he? He's been quiet since Thursday," Eleanor said. "His lawyer arrived from Richmond on Friday. A man named Griggs. He and Nathaniel have been in the study for 2 days." She paused. "Griggs sent a formal communication to Pembroke on Saturday requesting a delay in the county proceedings. Pembroke declined." Thomas absorbed this. "Griggs is a hard man. So is Pembroke," Eleanor said. "And Pembroke has the original will, 2 corroborating witnesses, now 3 with Mrs. Garner here, and a signed statement from Nathaniel himself." She let that settle. "Nathaniel didn't know about the signed statement when Griggs arrived. I imagine that was an interesting conversation." Thomas made the sound that was almost a laugh again. Then he went to write his letter. Eleanor went to her study and sat with Erasmus Cole's bundle of unsent letters and read every one of them before midnight. By the time the hall clock struck 12, she understood the full shape of what Edmund Ashford had built and what Nathaniel had dismantled, and she sat with that understanding, the way you sit with something that is both terrible and clarifying, something that hurts, and also finally makes sense of the pain that came before it. She had just set the last letter down when she heard voices from the north corridor. Raised voices. Nathaniel's low and controlled but stripped of its usual polish. And another voice, sharper, faster, Griggs. She did not move toward the sound. She sat still and listened to the rhythm of it, the way you read weather. Not the words from this distance, but the shape of what was happening. Then a door slammed. Then footsteps fast, purposeful, coming down the main staircase. She heard them reach the entry hall, pause, turn toward her study. She had time to fold her hands on the desk before her door opened. Griggs was not what she had pictured from Pembroke's brief description. He was short and broad and had the face of a man who had won a great many arguments and attributed this entirely to his own intelligence, rather than to the willingness of others to simply stop engaging with him. He came through her door without knocking, which told her something. Behind him, Nathaniel stood in the doorway, and from his expression, she could see that the door slamming had been Griggs's doing, and that Nathaniel was not entirely pleased about it. "Mrs. Ashford," Griggs said, "I'll be direct." "Please," Eleanor said. "You have in your possession documents pertaining to the Ashford estate that were obtained without your husband's knowledge or consent. You have shared those documents with an outside lawyer and with the county magistrate's office. You have engaged a woman, Helen Garner, who has no legal standing in this matter, and whose recollections after 30 years are of questionable reliability. And you have communicated with a woman in Philadelphia whose connection to this estate has not been legally established. He put both hands on the front edge of her desk. I am advising you, as a courtesy, to cease all of these activities immediately and to return all documents to the estate's possession pending a formal review. Eleanor looked at his hands on her desk. Then she looked at his face. "Mr. Griggs," she said, "take your hands off my desk." He blinked. "This is my study," she said. "In my home. Remove your hands from my desk, sit down in that chair, and if you have something to say to me, say it like a man who is speaking to a person rather than issuing a decree to a subordinate." She held his gaze without heat. "I'll wait." Behind Griggs in the doorway, she saw something cross Nathaniel's face. Not satisfaction. He was too compromised for satisfaction, but something like recognition. Griggs took his hands off the desk. He did not sit, but he took a step back, which was enough. "The documents," Eleanor said, "were in a room in this house. A room in this house that had been locked without my knowledge or consent since before my marriage. I found them in the course of managing this household in my husband's 8-month absence." She paused. "If we are discussing what has been done without knowledge or consent, Mr. Griggs, I suggest you review the full list carefully before deciding who is on the wrong side of that phrase." She picked up Pembroke's most recent communication from her desk and held it out. "This is a formal notice from my lawyer. You'll want to read it before our next conversation." Griggs took it. He read it. His face did not change, but his breathing did a subtle shift, the kind that a careful observer catches. "The court date is set," Eleanor said. "August 14th. Pembroke is ready. Mrs. Garner is here and has agreed to testify. Erasmus Cole has provided 31 letters documenting his direct knowledge of Edmund Ashford's intentions and final wishes." She folded her hands. "And Nathaniel, as you may or may not be aware, provided a signed written statement to me on Thursday describing the 1811 conversation with Thomas Reed in his own hand." A pause. "I have the original. Pembroke has a copy. Mr. Caldwell has the copy. The county magistrate's office has a copy." Griggs turned slowly to look at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said nothing. "Get out of my study, Mr. Griggs," Eleanor said. Not loudly, not with anger, simply with the tone of a woman who has said what needs saying and is finished with the conversation. "You're welcome to the sitting room down the hall if you and Nathaniel need to continue your discussion, but you're done in here." Griggs left. Nathaniel stayed in the doorway for a moment. He looked older tonight than he had 4 days ago. Not just tired, diminished. The careful architecture of the man he had presented to the world for 41 years was losing its structure the way a building loses structure when the foundational thing that holds it up is quietly, irreversibly removed. "Griggs told me there is no path," Nathaniel said. Those were his words. "No path to a successful challenge of the original, well, given the witnesses and the documentation." He paused. "He's recommending I settle." Eleanor waited. "A settlement would mean acknowledging Thomas's claim," Nathaniel said. "And the Philadelphia woman's. And the boy." He said the word carefully, the way you say a word you haven't used before and aren't sure fits your mouth. "Samuel." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It would mean all of that. And your father's money." "That's a separate matter," Eleanor said. "The fraud inquiry proceeds regardless of any settlement on the will. You know that." He was quiet. "Griggs says I might lose the house." "You might," Eleanor agreed. "Depending on how the accounts come out and what the court decides about the missing funds." She looked at him. "But Nathaniel, the house was never entirely yours to begin with. That's rather the point." He didn't flinch. He took it the way people take things when they have already somewhere private and unwitnessed accepted them. "I made a choice in 1811, he said. "I was 35 years old, and my father had just died, and I was looking at a will that gave half of everything I had been raised to believe was mine to 2 people I had not been told existed." His voice was not quite steady. "I made a bad choice." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You did." "I have been making it every year since." "Yes." "I don't know how to—" He stopped. "I don't know what a man does with that." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father, who had made an arrangement regarding his daughter without consulting his daughter. She thought about Edmund Ashford, who had tried to correct his mistakes in a will and then died before it mattered. She thought about Thomas, who had held his silence for 20 years and called it loyalty. "I think," she said carefully, "that what a man does with that is exactly what you've started to do. He says it out loud. He writes it down. He stops spending energy maintaining a version of events that is not true." She paused. "It doesn't undo the years, Nathaniel. I won't tell you it does. But it's the only direction that leads somewhere that isn't worse." He looked at her for a long time. "I'm sorry," he said. "About your father's money. About the arrangement, the letters 1808. About—" He stopped. "About all of it." "I know," she said. "I'll tell you what I told Thomas. That's enough for today." He left. She sat alone in her study for a long while after. She was not triumphant. She had expected to feel something larger at this moment, some sense of arrival of the ground solidifying beneath her feet. What she felt instead was very quiet. The particular quiet that settles after a long storm when the air is still, and the damage is visible, and the work of rebuilding has not yet begun. The next morning, Caroline Mercer came to her door. She had been quiet for days, thoughtful, careful, moving through the house with the particular self-consciousness of a person who is not sure whether they have the right to take up space. Eleanor had let her be. She had learned from her own experience that the processing of difficult truths could not be rushed and should not be narrated. But Caroline came to her door on Monday morning with a different expression than the one she had been wearing. Something had resolved in her face overnight. "I want to go home," she said. "To Richmond. I want to go back to my father." "All right," Eleanor said. "But before I go—" Caroline came into the room and sat down without being asked, which Eleanor took as a sign of progress. "I want to know about my father's dealings with Nathaniel. All of it. The documents Caldwell found." Eleanor opened her desk drawer. She had prepared this, actually had anticipated this exact conversation, and had set aside 3 days ago a summary of the relevant documentation that she had asked Caldwell to prepare. She placed it on the desk and slid it toward Caroline. Caroline read it slowly. Her face, as she read, went through several changes. None of them dramatic, all of them real. The kind of changes that happen on a face when a person is learning something that hurts and has decided not to look away from it. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at the wall for a moment. "He used my father's name," she said, "as a guarantee, without telling my father he was doing it." "Yes," Eleanor said. "And my father, when he found out—" "According to the correspondence Caldwell found, your father discovered it in February of this year. He wrote to Nathaniel. Nathaniel wrote back promising to resolve it." She paused. There was no further resolution. Caroline was very still. "My father has been worried for months. I thought it was his health." She looked down at her hands. "It was this." "Likely, yes." "Is my father in legal trouble?" "Not from anything I intend to pursue," Eleanor said. "Your father was used, not complicit. That distinction matters, and I intend to make it clearly in any proceeding." She held Caroline's eyes. "But he should know the full picture. He needs his own lawyer separate from Nathaniel's to protect his interests going forward." Caroline nodded. She picked up the summary pages, folded them, and placed them in her own bag. "May I keep these?" "They're yours," Eleanor said. "Caldwell prepared that copy for you." She stood. At the door she paused. "Mrs. Ashford, Eleanor." She turned. "When this is over, when all of it is settled, what happens to you?" It was a genuine question, not unkind. The question of a woman who has begun to see Eleanor as a person and is wondering about that person's future. Eleanor thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "I have learned that I am quite capable of managing on my own. Whether I end up managing this estate or my father's property in Richmond, or something else entirely." She paused. "I find I'm less frightened of not knowing than I expected to be." Caroline looked at her. "You should not have been in this marriage?" she said. I know I have no standing to say that. You have standing, Eleanor said. You just came through the same door. Caroline left before noon. Eleanor stood at the window and watched the carriage go and felt no particular resentment, only the clean, uncomplicated sense of a thing having resolved itself correctly. The hearing was set for August 14th. It was now the 28th of July. 17 days. Pembroke arrived on Wednesday with Griggs, and they sat across from each other at the long parlor table, while Eleanor sat at the end and Thomas sat beside her. Helen Garner was there as well, upright in her chair, with her hands folded with the expression of a woman who has been waiting 30 years for this particular meeting and is not planning to be rushed through it. Griggs opened. He proposed a settlement that acknowledged Thomas's claim to 1/3 of the estate, disputed the Philadelphia woman's claim on grounds of insufficient documentation of parentage, and proposed a private financial arrangement for the boy Samuel, in lieu of any legal recognition. Pembroke listened to all of it without expression. Then he placed 3 documents on the table. The first was Helen Garner's signed affidavit, witnessed and notarized, confirming that she had been present when Edmund Ashford's original will was prepared and signed and had put her own name to it in the knowledge of all its provisions. The second was a letter from Margaret Foster's Philadelphia lawyer, confirming a separate strand of documentation that Margaret had obtained through her own inquiries over the year's correspondence between Edmund Ashford and the family. He had placed her with letters that confirmed her parentage in Edmund's own hand. The third document Griggs had not expected. Eleanor could see it in the way he went still when he picked it up. She had not told Pembroke about this one. Pembroke had found it himself through the inquiry into the Richmond National Bank account. Through 2 weeks of careful work, she had not been fully informed of until Monday. It was a transfer record. $15,000 from the estate account moved in increments over 18 months, not to the Richmond National Bank as she had initially believed. The Richmond National had been a second stop. The first stop was a private account. The private account belonged, according to the transfer record, not to Nathaniel, but to Griggs. Eleanor watched Griggs read his own name on that document. She had expected, she wasn't certain what she had expected. Denial, perhaps. Argument. The particular aggressive redirection of a man who has been caught doing something and knows the only move left is to make the catching seem suspect. Instead, Griggs set the document down very carefully. He straightened the edge of it against the table. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel was looking at the document. "You told me," Nathaniel said slowly, "that those transfers were legal fees." Griggs said nothing. "Over 18 months, Nathaniel said. "You told me they were structured legal fees disbursed gradually for tax." He stopped. He picked up the document. He read it again. "This is not a legal fee account. This is a personal account." "Nathaniel, how much of this is mine?" Nathaniel said. His voice had gone very flat. Eleanor sat perfectly still. This was not a development she had anticipated, not this specific version of it. She had known the money had moved through Griggs. She had not known or fully considered that Griggs might have taken a portion of it that Nathaniel himself was not aware of. The room had the particular charge of a moment when a situation rearranges itself in real time. "All of the 15,000, Pembroke said, passed through Mr. Griggs's personal account. We have traced 9,000 of it onward to various locations, most of which appear to be connected to Mr. Nathaniel Ashford's activities in Richmond. The remaining 6,000, he looked at Griggs, we have not yet traced." "You stole from me," Nathaniel said. It wasn't quite a question. Griggs stood. "This proceeding is adjourned." "Sit down," Nathaniel said. It was the voice Eleanor remembered from the beginning, the one that assumed it would be obeyed. For once, she was glad to hear it. Griggs sat. What followed was 40 minutes that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, not because of the drama of it, but because of the clarity. The way a room full of people who have been lying to each other, or lying to themselves, or simply not saying the true thing, suddenly finds itself forced to deal only in facts. Griggs had been Nathaniel's lawyer for 15 years. He had been involved in the preparation of the false will in 1811, that much emerged in the first 10 minutes. He had used that knowledge ever since as quiet leverage. Small amounts at first, then larger. The 15,000 from Eleanor's father's estate was the most recent and largest, and it had been Griggs's idea presented to Nathaniel as a tax strategy, structured as legal fees, moved through channels that Nathaniel had trusted without examining because Nathaniel had trusted Griggs. By the end of the 40 minutes, Griggs had nothing left to say. He had the look of a man who has arrived at the absolute bottom of a thing and is sitting in it. Pembroke said, "I will be filing an additional complaint with the county court regarding the fraudulent transfer of funds from Mr. Griggs's account. This is separate from the estate proceedings and separate from the inquiry into Mrs. Ashford's inheritance funds." He looked at Griggs steadily. "You may want to arrange new representation." Griggs left. He did not say goodbye. The room was very quiet. Thomas looked at the table. Helen Garner looked at her hands. Pembroke made notes. Nathaniel sat at the far end of the table, with the expression of a man who has just discovered that the person he trusted with his secrets was the person using them against him, and is trying to determine whether this makes him a villain or a victim, and is finding that the answer, like most true answers, is both. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. "I didn't know about the 6,000, he said, to her specifically, not to the room. "I know," she said. "I did wrong things," he said. "I know what I did, but the 6,000 I didn't know about the 6,000. "I know," she said again. "Pembroke will establish that clearly." He nodded. He looked at Thomas. "Thomas, He stopped. "I know there is nothing I can say." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then, in the voice of a man who has thought about this for a very long time and has arrived somewhere more complex than simple anger, "You can say it anyway." Nathaniel looked at him. "You can say it anyway," Thomas repeated. "It won't fix it, but say it." A long silence. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said, "for what I took from you, for what my father gave me that wasn't mine to take, for 20 years for all of it." Thomas nodded once. He didn't forgive him. He didn't say he did. He simply received the words, as words which was its own kind of grace. Eleanor stood. "August 14th, she said. "We meet at the courthouse, all of us." She looked around the table. Pembroke, Thomas, Helen Garner. "Between now and then, I want everything in order. Every document filed, every affidavit notarized, every account reconciled." She picked up her papers. "I want nothing left in a box." She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard Thomas say very quietly to no one in particular, "She sounds like her father." And Helen Garner, who had known Edmund Ashford for 12 years and had known what was in his will for 30, said, "She sounds better than her father." Eleanor kept walking. She had 17 days. And for the first time since she had found the letter in the wrong satchel 4 months ago, she was not afraid of any of them. Margaret Foster arrived on the 10th of August, 4 days before the hearing. Eleanor knew the carriage before it stopped a hired coach from the Richmond Post Road, plain and practical, the kind a woman takes when she is traveling on serious business and not making a social call. She was standing on the front steps when it pulled up because she had received Erasmus Cole's letter that morning saying Margaret had left Philadelphia on the 7th, and Eleanor had learned by now that it was better to meet things at the door than to wait for them to find you. The woman who stepped down from the carriage was not what Eleanor had imagined. She had imagined someone tentative. Someone who had spent years wondering about her origins and had arrived in a state of uncertainty, needing reassurance, needing to be led. What stepped out of that carriage was a woman of 44, who moved with the particular decisiveness of someone who has made a significant journey and has clear intentions about what happens next. She was dark-haired like Thomas, with Edmund Ashford's brow and a jaw that was entirely her own. She looked at the house the way Eleanor had looked at the box, without flinching, with the steady gaze of someone who has decided to see whatever is there. She looked at Eleanor and said, "You're the one who opened the room." "I am," Eleanor said. "Good," Margaret said. "I've been waiting for someone to do that for 6 years." They went inside. Eleanor had arranged things carefully. Thomas was waiting in the parlor, and she had told him simply that morning that Edmund Ashford's daughter was arriving and that she wanted him there. He had said nothing for a long moment. Then he had said, "All right." And he had been in the parlor since 10 o'clock, sitting in the same chair he always sat in, with his hands folded and his face arranged in the careful stillness of a man preparing for something large. When Margaret walked through the parlor door and saw him, she stopped. Thomas stood. They looked at each other across the room. Two people who had the same father and had never known the other existed, who had each grown up in the absence of a truth that should have been theirs from the beginning. Eleanor stood near the door and did not speak and did not move, because this was not her moment. This moment belonged to them. Margaret said, "You're Thomas Reed." "I am," he said. "Erasmus told me about you," she said. "He said you kept this house running for 40 years and never once got credit for it." Thomas's jaw moved. Erasmus was always generous. "He said you were the best man Edmund Ashford ever produced." She paused. He meant that as a complicated compliment. Thomas made the sound that was almost a laugh. It was more complete this time than Eleanor had ever heard it. "That sounds like Erasmus," he said. Margaret crossed the room and held out her hand. Thomas took it. They shook hands formally, carefully, and then something shifted, and it was not quite an embrace, but it was more than a handshake, the way two people hold on when they are both finally, after a long time, not alone in something. Eleanor left the room quietly and closed the door behind her. She went to her study and sat at her desk and allowed herself for exactly 5 minutes to feel something she had not permitted herself to feel in months. Not triumph. Something quieter and more honest than triumph. The particular relief of a person who has been holding a great weight and has finally, with help, set it down in the right place. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Pembroke came that afternoon with the final prepared documents for the hearing. They sat together for 2 hours, going through every line. Thomas joined them after an hour with Margaret beside him, and Eleanor watched the two of them move through the parlor together with the tentative, careful ease of people who are still learning the dimensions of each other, but have already decided the learning is worthwhile. Pembroke laid out what would happen on August 14th with the precision of a man who had prepared for every foreseeable challenge. Edmund's original will would be presented. Helen Garner's testimony would confirm its validity. Erasmus Cole had provided a written statement. He was too old to travel, but Pembroke had gone to Miller's Road himself the previous week and taken his account personally signed and witnessed. Margaret's documentation from Philadelphia, combined with Edmund's own letters confirming her parentage, established her claim. Thomas's claim required no further documentation. At this point, Nathaniel's own signed statement had done more than any other single piece of evidence to confirm it. The fraud inquiry was a separate proceeding, but Pembroke noted that Griggs had, in the week since the parlor confrontation, provided a full accounting of the $6,000 in exchange for a reduced charge. The money was traceable. It would be recovered. That matter would resolve itself. "And Nathaniel," Margaret said. It was the first time she had spoken his name directly. She said it without particular emotion, the way you say the name of a person you are still determining how to feel about. "Nathaniel has agreed to the settlement terms," Pembroke said. 1/3 of the estate to Thomas. 1/3 to Margaret. His own third is subject to the fraud proceedings, but depending on how those resolve, he may retain some portion. He paused. He will not be at the hearing. His new lawyer, he engaged someone from Charlottesville after Griggs advised him that his presence would be more damaging than his absence. He agreed. Eleanor said nothing. She had expected this. She had, if she was honest, anticipated it the morning after the parlor confrontation. Nathaniel was many things, but he was not at his core. Someone who fought losing battles past the point of losing. What he was in the end was a man who had made choices that compounded over 20 years until the weight of them was more than any architecture of lies could support. The estate, Thomas said carefully. The house itself. What happens to it? Pembroke looked at Eleanor. Eleanor had thought about this more than anything else in the past 2 weeks. She had lain awake with it. She had walked through the house with it room by room, floor by floor, the east wing and the south wing and the kitchen yard and the barn and the fields that ran down to the creek. She had thought about what the house was and what it had been built on and what it had been used to hide. "I've proposed something to Pembroke," she said. "I want to hear what both of you think." They listened. What Eleanor proposed was not simple, but it was clear. The house and the core property would be held jointly between the three claimants herself, Thomas and Margaret, not as a legal fiction, but as a working arrangement with Thomas managing the estate, as he always had, but now in his actual capacity as part owner, with a proper salary and proper legal standing. Margaret's share would provide income for her family in Philadelphia, but would not require her to live in Virginia unless she chose to. Eleanor's share would allow her to remain in the house, which she intended to do not out of attachment to the house itself, but because she had work to finish. "What work?" Margaret asked. Eleanor picked up a single sheet of paper from her desk and placed it in front of them. It was a letter. From the county judge's wife, the woman who had recommended Pembroke, the woman who had written back about Miller's Road. The woman who had been Eleanor had discovered over the course of this summer considerably more useful and more interested than her social role suggested. The letter proposed something Eleanor had mentioned in passing in a conversation 3 weeks ago. A school, not a grand institution, a practical one, for children in the county who had no access to formal education, children like Samuel, who was 8 years old and quick-minded, and was currently being taught to read by his mother in a small cottage on the edge of town, because there was nowhere else for him to go. "The East Wing," Eleanor said. "The rooms on the ground floor. They've been used for storage for 20 years. Before that, according to what Erasmus Cole told Thomas Edmund Ashford's father, used them as a reading room." She paused. "I want to open them." Thomas looked at her. His expression did something complicated. "Edmund's grandfather was the one who built those rooms," he said quietly. "He was the one who first talked about he wanted to start a school once. Never happened." He looked at the letter. "Edmund talked about it sometimes. Said it was the one thing his grandfather had wanted that never got done." "Then it's overdue," Eleanor said. Margaret was reading the judge's wife's letter. "She's offering county support," she said. "Funding. She's been trying to establish something like this for 3 years and hasn't had the right location." She looked up. "She's been waiting for someone with a house big enough and the willingness to use it." "Yes," Eleanor said. Margaret set the letter down. She looked at Eleanor with the direct assessing gaze she had brought off that carriage 4 days ago. "You have been planning this for a while." "Since April," Eleanor said. "When I first opened the East Wing and understood what those rooms could be." She paused. "I didn't know then who would be at this table when I proposed it. I only knew that if I managed to get through the summer with the truth intact, this was what I wanted to do with it." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My eldest daughter is a teacher in Philadelphia. She has been for 3 years. I have been trying to find her a position with more scope." She set her hands flat on the table in the way Eleanor had come to recognize as her gesture of decision. "I'll write to her." Thomas looked at the window. "Samuel should be there," he said. "At whatever school this becomes, he should be one of the first students." "He will be," Eleanor said. Pembroke gathered his papers with the efficient quietness of a lawyer who knows when his work is done and when other people's work is beginning. "August 14th, he said. 8 o'clock. I'll see you all there." He left. The three of them sat in the parlor in the particular silence of people who have just made something real, not final, yet not witnessed yet, but real in the way that decisions are real when they are made by people who mean them. Thomas said, "Miss Eleanor." "Eleanor," she said. "Just Eleanor." He looked at her. "Eleanor." The word sat differently in his mouth than the formal address had. More honest. More like what they actually were to each other, not mistress and servant, not employer and employee, but two people who had navigated the same house and the same truth, and had come out on the same side of it. "Thank you." She shook her head. "Don't thank me. Work with me." "Same thing in the end," Thomas said. Margaret made a sound. A short, genuine sound, the first real laugh Eleanor had heard from her. "I think," Margaret said, "I am going to like Virginia." The 14th of August arrived with the heavy certainty of Virginia summer, the kind of morning where the air is already working before the sun is fully up, and the roads hold the previous day's heat in the dust, and everything feels slightly more real than usual, slightly more present. Eleanor dressed carefully. Not elaborately, she was not performing anything, but carefully the way her mother had taught her to dress for important things with attention, with intention, with the acknowledgement that how you present yourself to a serious moment is its own form of respect for that moment. Thomas was waiting in the entry hall when she came downstairs. He was wearing his best coat. He had his hat in his hands. "Ready," she said. "Been ready for 20 years, he said. They went together. The Culpeper County Courthouse was not a large building, but it had the particular gravity of a place where things are decided and recorded, where words become official and facts become permanent. Eleanor had been inside it once before as a girl when her father had argued a case that she had not been permitted to hear, but which she had sat outside waiting for with the absolute conviction that this place, these proceedings, the formal establishment of what was true and what was not, was the most important thing that human beings had constructed. She still believed that. Pembroke was already inside. Helen Garner was there. Thomas had brought her from the South Wing, where she had spent the past 2 weeks being in Eleanor's assessment. The most useful house guest she had ever had. Precise, well-rested, and possessed of a memory for dates and details that made her an extraordinary witness. Margaret sat beside Thomas straight-backed, with her hands folded and her face composed with the particular serenity of someone who has been waiting a long time and has therefore used up all their nervousness well in advance. The county magistrate was a man named Hargrove. Eleanor had met him twice, once at a dinner once, when she had filed the initial petition. He was thorough and fair, and had been told by the judge's wife, been quietly troubled by the Ashford estate accounts for some years, without a clear legal basis to inquire into them. He had one now. The proceeding lasted 4 hours. Helen Garner testified for 40 minutes. Her account was exact, unhurried, and completely consistent with the documentary. Record the date the will was prepared, the names of everyone present, the specific provisions Edmund Ashford had described to her on the day she signed it. When Nathaniel's Charlottesville lawyer attempted to suggest that her memory after 30 years was unreliable, she looked at him with the calm devastation of a 71-year-old woman who has been waiting 3 decades for this exact question. "I remember it," she said, "because Edmund Ashford sat me down before I signed and told me what was in it and why. He said he had not been a perfect man, but he intended to be an honest one where it still mattered. He said he was sorry it had taken him this long." She paused. When a man says something like that, you remember it, every word. The Charlottesville lawyer did not ask her a second question. Pembroke presented the documents in sequence: the original will, the acknowledgement letter, Erasmus Cole's written statement, the financial records, Nathaniel's own signed account of the 1811 conversation. The county recorder received each one and entered it into the official record, with the slow, deliberate precision of someone who understands that what they are doing will matter long after this room has emptied. Margaret's documentation from Philadelphia was the last thing entered. The letters Edmund had written to the family, who raised her careful, formal letters that said nothing explicit but confirmed, through their very existence and their careful concern, what he had never been able to say publicly. Her lawyer in Philadelphia had prepared a detailed brief. Pembroke read the relevant sections. Hargrove listened without interruption. When it was over, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The court finds the original will of Edmund Ashford, dated March 1809, to be valid and enforceable. The prior will filed in 1811 is hereby invalidated as inconsistent with the testator's documented final intentions and prepared under circumstances this court finds irregular." He looked at the clerk. "Let the record reflect the legal standing of Thomas Reed Margaret Foster, née Ashford, and Eleanor Whitmore Ashford, as claimants to the Ashford estate in the proportions specified in the original document." He looked up at the room. "The fraud inquiry will proceed on a separate docket. This proceeding is closed. Unforgettable. Ban." He struck the table. The sound of it went through Eleanor like something physical, not a shock, but a completion. The sound of a thing being finished properly. She sat still for a moment while the room moved around her. Pembroke shaking hands, the clerk shuffling papers. Thomas standing slowly with the look of a man who is not certain yet that what just happened is real and is giving himself time to determine whether to trust it. Margaret leaned over and said very quietly directly into Eleanor's ear, "He wrote my name in that will. Edmund Ashford wrote my name." Her voice was not quite steady. "I never had a father who acknowledged me. I have had a name in a document for 30 years and no one told me." Eleanor turned to look at her. "He tried," Eleanor said, "in the ways he knew how. It wasn't enough and it was too late, and I know that doesn't fix what it was like not to know." She held Margaret's eyes. "But he tried, and it's yours now. Your name is on the record." Margaret pressed her lips together, nodded once. Thomas was standing at the end of the bench with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, looking at the wall above the magistrate's bench where the proceeding had just ended. Eleanor went to him. "Thomas," she said. He looked at her. His eyes were dry, but only barely. He had the expression of a man who has just been given something he had stopped permitting himself to want. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "Your mother's name is in the official record now," she said. "Her letter is entered into evidence. Permanent." She paused. She wanted to be remembered accurately. She is. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "She would have liked you," he said. "I think I would have liked her," Eleanor said. They walked out of the courthouse together. Eleanor Thomas, Margaret Pembroke, Helen Garner, into the August heat, into the particular brightness of a Virginia summer morning that had no interest in the weight of what had just happened inside and was simply indifferently beautiful. Erasmus Cole was there. Eleanor had not known he was coming. He was 81 years old and had not, by Thomas's account, left his property on Miller's Road in 2 years. But he was there standing on the courthouse steps with a neighbor's boy who had evidently driven him in leaning on a cane and wearing a coat that had been good once and was still dignified. He looked at the group of them coming through the door, and his face went through something private and complete that Eleanor did not feel she had the right to look at too long. Margaret saw him and went still. Then she walked to him, and she took his hands in both of hers, and she said something that Eleanor could not hear. Whatever it was, it made the old man close his eyes and bow his head once slowly, the gesture of a person receiving something they have waited a very long time for. Eleanor looked away. She looked instead at the road ahead, at the ordinary life of Culpeper. Going past a wagon. 2 men talking, a woman with a basket, a dog sleeping in a patch of shade. The unremarkable, continuous, unhurried life of a place that did not know and did not need to know what had just happened in the building behind her. She thought about the East Wing, the rooms with the marks on the doorframe, the rooms that had been locked and storage and secret and locked again, carrying the weight of everything no one had been permitted to say. She was going to open every window. Samuel came that afternoon. Iris brought him to the house at 3 o'clock, and Eleanor was in the parlor when they arrived, and she heard Samuel before she saw him, his voice in the entry hall rapid and certain, asking Thomas whether it was true that the house had a library, because he had heard it did, and he had never seen a real library before. Thomas said, "There will be one. Miss Eleanor is building it." "Can I help?" Samuel asked. Eleanor came to the doorway. Samuel looked at her with the frank assessment she had come to recognize from their first meeting, the unguarded, accurate gaze of a child who has not yet learned to disguise what he sees. "Can I help with the library?" he asked her directly. "You can," she said. "You can help choose where the shelves go. That's an important job." He considered this seriously. "All right," he said, and walked past her into the parlor to begin his assessment of the available wall space. Iris stood in the entry hall with her hands clasped, and the expression Eleanor had first seen on her face, the wariness of a woman who is not sure of her welcome. Eleanor looked at her directly. "He belongs here," Eleanor said. Not because of Nathaniel, because of himself. Because he is bright and curious, and this house is going to have books in it, and he should have access to them. She paused. And because... She stopped, chose the words carefully. Because no child should be paying for a locked room they didn't know existed. Iris's expression shifted slowly, the way things shift when they have been held in tension for a long time and are finally permitted to release. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Eleanor said. "I'm going to ask him to organize the shelves by subject, and I suspect his system will be entirely his own, and I will have to defend it to everyone else." Iris almost smiled. "He alphabetizes by color of spine," she said. "He thinks that's more logical." "He may be right," Eleanor said. She heard from the parlor the sound of Samuel explaining to Thomas why the west wall was the better choice for tall books, because the light came from the east in the morning, which meant the spines would be less likely to fade, and Thomas responding with the patient, genuine attention of a man who takes a child's reasoning seriously. She stood in the hallway and listened to it, and felt the house settle around it differently than it had settled around anything in 8 years. Nathaniel left Ashford Estate on the 17th of August. He did not make an announcement. He did not ask for a formal farewell. Eleanor was in the east wing when she heard his carriage in the front drive, and she did not go down. But she heard from Thomas later that before Nathaniel got into the carriage, he had asked where Samuel was. Thomas had told him in the east wing, with Mrs. Ashford organizing books. Nathaniel had stood in the drive for a moment with that information. Then he had gotten into the carriage. Thomas said, "He didn't look happy. But he looked like a man who has put something down, something heavy." "That's what it looks like," Eleanor said. "I know that look." She did not hate him. She had examined that possibility carefully over the past weeks and found it to be a waste of a resource she needed for other things. What she felt for Nathaniel Ashford was the complicated, clear-eyed assessment of a woman who had known someone for 8 years and had finally, at the end of it, understood who they actually were. He was a man who had made a wrong choice when he was 35 and had spent the next 6 years finding that every subsequent choice was shaped by it. She did not excuse that. She did not romanticize it. She simply saw it the way she saw everything now accurately, without flinching, without the softening that comes from wanting things to be different than they are. She turned back to Samuel, who was asking whether philosophy should go before or after history, on the grounds that you needed to understand how people thought before you could understand what they did. "Before," she said. He nodded, satisfied, and began moving books. The school opened in October. It was not grand. It was not finished. The east wing rooms still smelled faintly of the years they had been closed, and 2 of the windows stuck in their frames, and the shelves Samuel had organized needed adjustment because his color spine system, while logical in its own terms, proved less useful when someone needed to find a specific book in a hurry. But it had 8 students on the first-day children from the county who had no other place to go for an education, and Margaret's daughter had arrived from Philadelphia the previous week and was by every account the most effective teacher any of them had encountered. On the first morning, Eleanor stood in the doorway of the east room and watched the children settle into their chairs. She looked at the marks on the doorframe, the penciled lines from knee-height to waist-height that had always told the story of a child who had been here and then gone. She took a pencil from her pocket. She added a new mark at the height of the tallest student in the room, a girl of 12 who stood with the straight, unself-conscious confidence of someone who has always believed she had the right to take up space. Then she stepped back and let the day begin. Thomas found her there later when the morning session had ended and the children had gone home for the midday meal. He stood beside her in the doorway and looked at the marks on the frame. "New ones," he said. "New ones." She agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say that a house takes its character from the people who choose it, not the people who own it." He looked at the room. "I think she would say this house has finally chosen right." Eleanor looked at the room, the books, the chairs, the light coming in through windows that were open for the first time in 20 years. "Tell me something, Thomas," she said. "When you came to my door the night I asked you to open the east wing, when you were standing in the hall waiting for me. Were you afraid? Thomas thought about this honestly. Yes, he said. I was afraid of what you'd find. I was afraid of what it would mean. I was afraid. He paused. I was afraid that even if the truth came out, nothing would change. That it would just be one more true thing that didn't matter to anyone with the power to do something about it. She nodded. And now, he looked at the room for a long moment. At the shelves, Samuel had organized at the marks on the doorframe, at the empty chairs, waiting for children who would come back tomorrow. Now, Thomas said, I reckon the truth was worth the telling. Eleanor put the pencil back in her pocket. She had arrived in this house 8 years ago as a practical arrangement between two families, a transaction dressed as a marriage, a woman delivered to a door she had not chosen. She had spent 8 years being quiet in rooms where silence was expected of her, watchful in corridors where watchfulness was not supposed to belong to her, careful with truths that other people had decided she should not know. She was not quiet anymore. She was not careful with other people's lies anymore. She was 34 years old in the house that was partly hers and partly Thomas's, and partly a woman in Philadelphia who was already planning her next visit. And the East Wing was full of children and books, and the sound of a future being built in a room that used to be locked. She had not rescued anyone. She had not been rescued. What she had done was simpler and harder than either of those things she had read. Everything questioned, everything written, everything down and refused in the quiet, absolute, unshakable way of a woman who has decided what she is worth to accept a locked door as a final answer. The truth had been in the box all along. It just needed someone willing to open it. Eleanor Whitmore Ashford had been willing, and that in the end had been enough.